Chapter 5 is intended to go hand in hand with the materials that I have on critical thinking. You should take a look at the critical thinking because it does kind of dovetail nicely into the concept of analyzing information and preparing to make a decision. It can be said that managers, their main job is to make decisions. On a daily basis, subordinates will go to them and ask what they need to do. They need guidance. They need to have clarity regarding what they're going to do. There may be problems that arise. And the manager's primary job is really to troubleshoot issues and figure out the best way to respond to a problem. And that requires a decision. Decision-making is the process by which managers take a look at whatever opportunities there are that you could take advantage of and whatever threats may be posed and whatever challenges and problems may have arisen so that you can figure out through an assessment of information that is available to you what the best course of action would be to either take advantage of that opportunity or to mitigate the risk of any type of threat that may be apparent. It's important to note that when you're making decisions, it is not always problem solving. It is potentially to take advantage of an opportunity, although I have to admit it does seem like most of the time we're just trying to put out fires and figure out how to solve problems that might arise. Program decision-making refers to the idea that you've already had experience doing some lower-level decisions, maybe that don't have a high level of import. If you wake up in the morning, you have a bowl of cereal, you eat the same cereal every day, you tried it out once, you're good with it, you're going to go with it. You may spend some time figuring out what you're going to wear today, but you've got a closet full of clothes, you've already made the decision which ones to buy. Routine, automatic decision-making, you don't give it a lot of thought. The only time that you revisit routine decisions are when there's some type of a problem or some type of a hiccup, or it becomes apparent that it may be a better option could be available to you. So you typically go through a decision-making process at the outset, and then once it is established, you just do a routine yes or no type of decision. And as I said, it really only gets revisited when there's an opportunity or a problem that arises. Programmed decision-making is useful because it provides expediency. You don't have to conduct a mountain of research to figure out what you should have for breakfast. The other thing to consider is the magnitude of the decision being made. You don't want routine decisions when you're buying a new computer system for your entire corporation. That's obviously something that needs to have a much more thought out decision. Routine program decision-making, by definition, is for things that do not carry a lot of risk if the decision is not correct. Non-programmed decisions are non-routine decisions. These are basically things that you have to gather information. You may have to educate yourself to some degree. You may have a problem that's never existed before, and you have to figure out how to resolve it. It's typically something that's unusual or unpredictable. And again, focus on the fact that it could be an opportunity as well as a threat. When non-programmed decisions come up, it's best to spend a little bit more time and maybe seek consultation with others who might have had experience with the issue if you haven't. A couple of things to consider when making decisions. You can rely on intuition. Intuition are ways of seeing the world based on feelings, belief, and hunches. It's typically a reactive decision. You don't give a lot of thought to it. It's typically based on experience, but it may not be based on the type of experience that leads to a good decision. Intuition is good in some contexts, but if your intuition is based on bias or a misunderstanding of something that occurred in the past, you will probably not be making the correct decision. On the other hand, if you have a lot of experience assessing art or looking at property, and you have a hunch that there may be a problem because you've gone through the same type of routine before, you may have a little voice inside your head telling you that, this is a certain approach should be taken to this. Intuition is good to maybe ring a bell and have you review some information that you may not otherwise want to include. Contrary to intuition, reasoned judgment is something that you spend a lot more time. You gather the information, you review it, you come up with alternative options for making a decision. Having options is very important. If you only come up with one potential decision, then you may be missing the opportunity to be creative and come up with other potential ways of resolving or taking advantage of whatever opportunity there is. Making a decision by its essence is that you are making a choice. So if there's a problem and I've come up with 3 or 4 ways to potentially solve it, I can then weigh each one of those options and come up with the best solution. In addition, I may actually come up with a hybrid decision. If I come up with 2 potential solutions and you come up with 2 potential solutions, we may be able to combine them and come up with a better solution that didn't exist previously. If I only come up with one solution, what do I do if it doesn't work? The so-called plan B is not a bad thing to have. So if you want to try one thing, it's not a bad idea to have other alternatives available. The classical model of decision making is that you need to follow a process. Process is simply a repeatable group of steps that you take. You want to be able to look at all possible alternatives, gather all the information, figure out what the consequences intended and otherwise or unintended may be, and then make a logical, rational decision to pick the most appropriate course of action. The problem with the classical decision-making model in a modern business environment is that it takes a lot of time, and time is not something that is plentiful at many businesses. The other thing is that the information that you may require may not be available to you, or you may not understand it. You may need to bring in other people and other experts, and again, that could take a lot of time. So classical decision-making, following that process is a good idea. It's a good basis. But the reality of the situation is you are not going to have an unlimited amount of time to make a decision. An optimum decision is a course of action that is selected because it is found to be in the best interest of the organization. It may not necessarily be what you think is the correct decision to make or the correct course of action, but you are not making decisions for yourself personally. You are making decisions based on what's best for the organization. The next slide is a graph that depicts the classical model of decision-making. So the first step would be to list all the alternative courses of action. You have to make sure that you have all that information. You can see the assumption on the right. The next step is to rank the alternative from least preferred to most preferred. Again, that is based on an assumption that you have the mental facility to be able to process that information. If somebody came to me with a physics issue or a computer science issue, something that I don't have training in, I'm going to have a hard time even being able to assess that information in an appropriate fashion to make a good decision. The last step is to select the alternative that leads to the desired consequences based on what the mission of the organization is. And again, that is based on the assumption that managers know what the future course of action is best for the organization. If it's a big decision to be made, chances are whatever decision that I come up with is going to be reviewed by others, maybe my boss, maybe a team, to make sure. So there are stopgaps that you can do. There are mitigating factors that you can implement. But again, the more layers of review, the more people working on it, the more time it could take. The administrative model of decision-making refers to an approach that it reflects reality a bit more. You're probably not going to have time. You may not be sure what the best thing for the organization is. You may think that something is a great idea, but in fact it has some risk that you are either failed to assess or are unable to recognize in order to assess. So the idea of the administrative model was created by March and Simon, two researchers who basically looked at the idealism of the classical model and recognized that it's probably not very realistic in the business world. Part of the components of the administrative model is based on bounded rationality. This is basically saying that everybody has their own experiences, their own level of expertise, their own basis of knowledge, but there are constraints to that. You do not have unlimited knowledge of all resources. You do not have access to all resources, and you may not be able to interpret them even if you did. You could be looking at information that someone with a higher level of expertise would think was quite important, and you may dismiss it simply because you're not fully informed about what it is that you're reviewing. The other thing is incomplete information. Because of time constraints, because of the lack of knowledge of where to find certain information, it can be very difficult to create a pool of data and information that is relevant to what it is that you're trying to resolve. Incomplete information leads to less effective decisions. The next slide has a graphic that just basically shows an illustration of why information may be incomplete. You've got uncertainty and risk, ambiguous information, and time constraints and information costs. Risk refers to the possibility that whatever action you're deciding to take could backfire or just simply fail. The higher the level of uncertainty because you have incomplete information probably is correlated very strongly to the higher level of risk that decision upon which the incomplete information is being based will not be fully accurate. Ambiguous information refers to information that you have that you may not simply understand. If you go back to the critical thinking materials that I provided, we talk about that. You may get some information where someone has written something and you're not exactly sure what it means. It could have dual meaning, it could have meaning in a different context. We already mentioned information costs. You may have the ability to access information, but you may have to pay for it, or the time that you have to spend collecting it and then reviewing it and educating yourself on it. That has an expense associated with it because it does take time. And if the clock is ticking on this decision that needs to be made, you may feel rushed and make a decision based on the information that you have that is best available to you at that moment. So the next slide, again, talking about risk, the degree of probability that possible outcomes will occur. So if we make a decision, the possible outcome is it could be a success, but it could also be a failure. We could put a new product onto market and nobody really likes it. And if we have to spend a lot of money to do it, then that would be a decision that carries some degree of risk. If we're doing an expansion of an existing product line, that has the least amount of risk because we already are doing something similar to that. If we're going into a new market, if we're going into a different country, if we're starting a new product line that we've never produced before, there's uncertainty, there is risk because we do not have a track record of success with that. Now, I probably mentioned this in the critical thinking video, but risk is a very common thing that has to be addressed in the business world by managers. And there's typically 4 ways to address risk. You can accept it, you can avoid it, you can mitigate it, or you can pass it on to someone else. If I drive to work in the morning, there is a slim but a real statistical possibility that I will be involved in a serious car accident and I might not make it to work. That is a risk. I could just accept that risk and just say, to hell with it, and I'm going to drive to work. Whatever happens, happens. I could avoid it. That means I could just stay at home, maybe not even get out of bed because it's too risky to get up. Accepting it on its own may be okay if the risk of something going bad is very small. Not accepting it, if I don't get out of my house, I'm not going to be able to live my life. I'm not going to be able to maybe earn a living. That would be a problem. Most of the time, how risk is addressed is by mitigation. You take steps to reduce the possibility of bad things happening. So when I'm driving to work, I drive the speed limit. I wear my seatbelt. I let people merge in. I don't have road rage. I drive defensively, all of those things. And the last step, which is to pass risk on to someone else, is basically the whole concept behind insurance. If I buy insurance for my car, if I'm in an accident, then my car will get taken care of. If I have health insurance, then I'll be taken care of if I'm injured in the car accident. So there are a lot of things that you can do with risk. You don't have to worry about risk quite so much if you have a solid decision that's being made that takes into account all of the potential eventual outcomes. Uncertainty is tied to risk, but it's a different category of risk. When Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, he famously made a comment that there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. He was mocked for this statement because people thought it was gibberish. They were talking about the war in Iraq at the time, and he was basically saying there are known knowns. You know about something, and you know that it's true. I know the sun is going to come up tomorrow. I know what time it's going to come up. There are known unknowns. I don't know if there's an asteroid that's going to come in 20 years and do some damage. We don't know that yet, but we know that it's a possibility. He also said that there are unknown unknowns, and that's the most difficult thing to deal with. That's when something happens and you didn't even foresee it as a possibility, so that you are unable to take defensive action, you are unable to mitigate for it. It's just something that came out of the blue, and you usually have to scramble. You can still address it, but it requires a great deal of flexibility and responsiveness to be able to react appropriately. The next slide is just an image. You can interpret it 2 different ways. You might have to stare at it for a second or two before the other image clicks in. It's the same thing with information. One person could look at this and see it one way, another person could look at it another. One person could be looking at a report with a budget, the other person could be looking at the same information and have it mean something different to them, and they would take divergent actions when making a decision on the same information. We've already mentioned time constraints, so a lot of times what managers have to do is the best they can with the information that they have available and the time that they have to be able to make a decision. A note about potential consequences. When you make a decision, you're making it with the intention that something is going to come from it. We talked about cause and effect in critical thinking. If I do something, I want it to cause the outcome, and hopefully it would be favorable. There could be an outcome, a consequence that I did not anticipate. I do a decision, and it turns out that some unforeseen outcome happens. There's an interesting assessment about Yellowstone National Park. About 100, 120 years ago, the government basically paid to remove the wolves from Yellowstone. The idea was that there were a lot of farmers, ranchers, they have herds of cattle and sheep, and the wolves were a threat because they were eating the cattle and the flocks that were costing money to the people in the area. So the wolves are basically eradicated. Skip 60 or 70 years into the future, and they discovered that there were no new aspen trees. Aspen trees are very important to Yellowstone National Park. The trees anchor the soil, they prevent soil erosion, they provide habitat for birds and other animals. And they found that there were no young trees. There were old trees, and the older trees that were so old that they were dying were not being replaced by any new aspen trees. And what they found was that the animals that were still there, such as deer and elk and moose, they were eating the shoots of the new trees without any threat from a predator, such as a wolf. They could just park themselves in a meadow and eat all of the young baby aspen trees. And for that reason, there were no really new aspen trees that were being developed. They reintroduced the wolf. They brought in some gray wolves from Canada. And surprisingly enough, they did find that there were some new aspen trees for the first time in quite some time. There are other factors that are weighing on it because there are environmental conditions that are also not particularly favorable to that tree continuing to grow. But there was definitely some type of an impact by killing off the wolves. And this is a completely unforeseen consequence. Nobody thought that if you killed off the wolves, that the trees would stop growing. That's one of those unknown unknowns when we talk about unforeseen consequences. You do want to take a moment, though, when you make a decision and figure out if a decision could be misinterpreted or people could use it to do something different. If you try to give someone a bonus at work and you highlight the type of behavior that we want them to do, one of the unforeseen consequences could be that if they start doing that behavior, they may ignore other things that they're supposed to be doing because you're not paying them for that. So you could end up with some unintended consequences, even from something as basic as having a bonus or reward system for your employees. Satisficing is a jargony business term that I've never actually heard used in the real world, but it is something that should be considered. It's the idea of coming up with good enough, for lack of a better way to put it. You have a problem, you're not trying to solve, world peace or anything else. You just need to get a decision that's made that's going to be good enough to be able to get through the day and move on to the next issue. Managers typically do this when they're overburdened and they don't have the time to make an optimal decision. So it kind of requires a bit of a triage. How important is this decision? How much time is it going to take me away from other things that I'm doing that are quite important as well? If I spend a lot of time and I make a great decision, but I didn't do my job, and we end up losing a bunch of money and have to close the store or close a branch or something, making a great decision in that case wasn't really worth it. So hopefully you've weighed the consequences of, or at least the importance of that decision, and you make a decision that's good enough, and you're not trying to be perfect. Steps in the decision-making process are highlighted on this. The first step is to recognize the need for even making a decision. That's actually more relevant than you may think. Sometimes people look at something and assume that it's a problem and there doesn't need to be a decision. In my job as an attorney, sometimes people are asking questions and people are saying, how do we answer them? And I say, give them what they asked for. You don't have to give them anything more than they asked for. You don't have to think about the consequences right now beyond the scope of what they're trying to do. Sometimes it looks like there may be a problem, but you have to think it through to find out if a decision actually needs to be made. If a decision does need to be made, then you should come up and generate alternatives. Like I said, it's always a good idea to have more than one alternative and then do a survival of the fittest. You vet them out and figure out which one looks to be the best version that will have the most favorable impact. So you generate the alternatives, you assess the alternatives, you choose the one that you want. You may keep a couple for plan B in case it doesn't work. You implement the chosen alternative, and then step 6 is kind of a gripe that I have because most people don't do that. You need to evaluate the decision, figure out if it was the right one, and go back and learn from it. If it was the wrong decision, you may need to figure out what kind of a decision-making process was involved. A lot of times people make a decision and then they just say, well, I'm glad that's over, and then they move on without really paying attention to it in the future. So it's very important when you implement a decision, which is a change in policy or whatever it may be, you have to go back and make sure that the decision that you made was correct. And if it was, that's great. You can emulate that in the future. If it wasn't, you should try to figure out a way to correct it so that you don't repeat it in the future. When you're making a decision, it should be through a lens where you examine whether or not it's practical, economical, ethical, or legal. As an attorney, yeah, you definitely don't want to be doing stuff that's illegal. It may give you a potential solution to your problem, but if you're going to go to jail for it or be fined for it, then it's not really going to be worth the risk. Ethical, the same thing. You don't want to be doing something that's going to put the company in a bad light. You don't want to be doing something that is going to be alienating either your employees or the stakeholders or your employees or your consumers, your customers. Is it economical? You could have the greatest decision in the world, the greatest solution in the world, and if it costs $50 million and you only have a budget of $50,000, it's pretty much off the table. Is it practical? If I have a great idea to implement a new decision, we're going to change the way that we do certain procedures. If it requires training for months on end, if we have to hire new people with different skill sets, is it really going to be practical? Is it ultimately going to fulfill a cost-benefit analysis? If we're going to be putting something into play, is the benefit that we get from its implementation going to be worth it in the end? You don't want to be making decisions that are going to be costing you more money. So whatever the process that you have, you do need to consider it through this type of a lens to make sure that you're not going to be running off in the wrong direction and wasting time on things that are not going to be practical, economical, or legal. Group decision-making typically is a better way of making a decision than individuals. A group decision can help alleviate bias because if you have other people with different perspectives, the one person making a decision may be stuck on a couple of things. They may not have all of the experience. They may not have a lot of knowledge in a particular field. You can always supplement someone's abilities, someone's knowledge, someone's perception by adding other people. So if you have a diverse group of people with a diverse level of backgrounds and you have them discuss what type of a decision should be made, you can usually come up with a better decision in the long run. Accessing information can be very difficult for one person to do. You can spread that out over a team. So maybe one or two people could look at certain parts of the information that's been collected. The other people can look at something else. Maybe it's part of their expertise. Rationing off the duties of making the decision amongst the team could be very advantageous. Groupthink is one of the downsides of group decision making. Sometimes people feel a sense of camaraderie and a sense of duty to the team that exceeds common sense from time to time. You don't want to let the group down. And if you're sitting in a group of people, and this is a well-known psychological effect, if you're sitting in a group of people and they are all agreeing with a topic that you think is probably not correct and maybe actually downright insane, people are less willing to stand up and say, what are you guys talking about? That doesn't make any sense. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to cause any issues with the people that they're working with. So a lot of times people in team settings tend to go along with the loudest voices or the majority, even if the majority may happen to be quite wrong. A famous example of groupthink was the Bay of Pigs crisis in Cuba under the Kennedy administration about 60 years ago. What ended up happening is the Kennedy administration decided that it would be a good idea to recruit Cuban refugees in exile and send them back to Cuba to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro. The CIA was involved. They dropped these people off on the beach, and they were basically massacred. And it was a huge embarrassment to the administration in the United States. When they were debriefing afterwards, Kennedy said, how did we ever do something so stupid? And basically, all of his advisors said, I thought you wanted to do it. And he said, I thought you wanted to do it. And somebody else said, I thought everybody wanted to do it. I thought it was crazy, but nobody spoke up. So one way that you can get around the dangers of groupthink is to assign a person to be what's known as a devil's advocate. Now, this is probably not correct, but the idea behind the term devil's advocate is in the Catholic Church, they have a process for making someone a saint. And when someone is worthy of being made into a saint, they assign a priest or a cardinal or someone to be the so-called devil's advocate, and they would be arguing why they shouldn't be given sainthood. The idea here is if you've got a group and the fear is that they don't want to stand out and maybe be seen as being contrarian or rocking the boat, they're not being a team player. If their job is to be the devil's advocate, if they're supposed to be the ones that are saying, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? Is this a good idea? That's their job and they're expected to do it. So you avoid some of the possibility that people will not be focusing on making comments because they feel that they're inappropriate, because by definition, they are assigned that job to do it. If they weren't coming up with alternatives or questioning everything that was being done, they're not fulfilling their role. So the idea of a devil's advocate is just someone to put a check on the group and make sure that they're moving in the right position. If the devil's advocate comes up with some questions and you are able to resolve them, then it's probably going to be a good decision. It's also good to have diversity among decision makers. I've already kind of talked to that. If you have a diverse group that aren't so saddled with conformity, they're going to be less prone to groupthink, and they can bring a lot of different perspectives in that may be missing if you have a group that is less diverse. Organizational learning and creativity falls into the decision-making categories. The more that you're able to give your employees access to information, the more well-rounded they'll be, and the better they'll be able to make decisions that would be beneficial to the company in the long run. Also, the more information that you have, you may be surprised at how you end up using it, and you can become more creative. The decision-making process itself is pretty creative. When you put a group of people together and they start talking about why they should do something or why they shouldn't do something, having that participative conversation and trying to come up with ideas for coming up with a solution is itself kind of a creative process. A learning organization is essentially a company that is committed to making sure that its employees and its managers are committed to letting individuals have access to learning and development training, have access to go into school if they need to, access to mentors, coaches, other people to give them the tools that they need to be able to maximize their potential going forward. It's called a learning organization because the mission of the organization embraces it. If you don't have management that is really dedicated to allowing people the opportunity to go to training and to get the development that they need, then it's very likely to be overlooked. In order to create a learning organization, part of the goals would be to create a personal mastery of a particular subject matter or multiple subject matters, build complex mental models, promote team learning, as we just discussed, build a shared vision for your learning organization, and then encourage system thinking. So make sure that you have processes in place, setting up teams and groups and opportunities for people to get together and come up with ideas for decisions. When you're making decisions, it doesn't always have to be in response to an opportunity or a threat. It can also be used to come up with ideas that haven't been thought of before. If you put people together in a group and they give them the opportunity to learn something new, that could create suggestions for processes that hadn't existed before, and the decision would be made to implement that. It's almost like a bonus level of information that you wouldn't ordinarily have access to. And again, we talked about competitive advantage back in chapters 1 and 10. Having a learning organization that can create these types of decision-making machines and new ideas can provide you with a competitive advantage if the competition isn't doing the same. So again, I've already talked over this slide a little bit. Decision-making and creativity kind of go hand in hand when you're trying to come up with a decision about which alternatives might be the best. Managers should give people the opportunities to work together and come up with new ideas, maybe a different way of doing the same thing that you've been doing for years. There may be a better way to do it, a more efficient way of doing it. You have to give people the opportunity to make mistakes, to experiment, and to learn from mistakes. That's easier said than done. I've been in situations where they tell people, oh, feel free, come up with an idea and try it out. If it doesn't work, that's great. And then those people never get promoted because they made a mistake. That's not the type of feedback that you want to have. You need to actually create an environment where people understand what types of things they can experiment with. You typically have to say what type of constraints there should be. We don't want you to take, $100 million and go blow it on something. But if you have certain access to a level of money to buy certain things, to try out things, and that's already been kind of pre-approved, then that creates a safer environment for people to maybe take a little bit of risk that could result in a larger reward than you would otherwise realize. Brainstorming is something that you're probably familiar with. It really needs to be managed correctly. There's several different strategies for doing it. One way that we've done it is I've sat in a room and we tried to come up with a bunch of different ideas. They used sticky notes and everybody came up with 5 or 10 ways of addressing it. They put it up on the wall. We had like 150 or 200 sticky notes up there, and we put them into different groups and tried to figure out how to classify it. And then we created teams to look at those ideas and figure out which ones were the best. The idea is to maybe stay hands-off as much as possible. You don't want to tell people what type of ideas to come up with. That's kind of the antithesis of brainstorming. You want people to come up with potentially radical and innovative ideas, things that haven't been thought of before. And you don't want to give any guidance until you actually collect everything. And then you can start to winnow them down about which ones are practical, economical, ethical, and legal. And then which ones make the most amount of sense. And we could actually figure out how we can take this brainstorming idea and turn it into something that would be, in reality, a process that we could utilize to make the company more competitive. Production blocking refers to bad brainstorming because it shouldn't be structured in the terms of what you're trying to achieve or the ends that you're trying to come up with, but it needs to be structured in how much time, what type of format you're following. If you just have a free-for-all with people talking about ideas and nobody writes anything down, it can be a colossal waste of time if you're not careful. So you have to be sure that you're going to be using your time productively. Nominal group technique is basically the idea of brainstorming without a group. You work on your ideas first instead of a spur of the moment. That may give you the opportunity to be a little bit more thoughtful in the ideas that you're coming up with, which could save time for the group. You would eventually meet with the group and then go over the ideas that you've come up with. People should still be encouraged to not be shy about coming up with something that could be considered a little bit outlandish. The idea of the nominal group technique is maybe to give people a little bit more time for reflection, but that doesn't mean that you should be throwing your more radical ideas in the trash. It just means that you should flesh them out a little bit more. The Delphi technique is just another spin on brainstorming. Sometimes people don't function particularly well if they have what they think is going to be perceived as a crazy idea. They don't want to mention it in front of other people. So if they just write down their ideas and then they submit it to the group in writing without any actual discussion going on, it may open the door for a little bit more creative discussion from people who may not be that excited about sharing their ideas in front of a whole bunch of people. Entrepreneurship is when you have someone within a company that's already been established acting like an entrepreneur. Again, it's kind of a business jargony thing that I have read in textbooks a lot. I've never actually used it on the job, but I'm also in a field that probably doesn't require a lot of entrepreneurial thinking. If you have an established company, a lot of times places like Facebook, they become established and then they just go out and buy things like Instagram. They buy new apps. What they would like to do is by having an entrepreneur, somebody internally replicating the kind of ideas that an entrepreneur would come up with, you do it internally, and then you don't have to go out and buy these other things. You're developing these new ideas on your own. Again, this is related to decision making because it's the same type of process. You come up with ideas, you do some training, you have new ideas that you come up with, you figure out which ones seem to make sense. And then if you can come up with something that's going to benefit the company, this is like found money. It's a found idea that you've come up with. So again, this is not always trying to fix a problem. This is actually looking at opportunities or even trying to discover opportunities that you may not have been aware of. A product champion is somebody who takes ownership of a particular project that has been created through one of these processes and follows it through to implementation to find out if it's going to work. Maybe it could be a pilot program first to see if it's feasible, but you put one person in charge, and if it works, then you can actually expand it and take advantage of it if it works correctly. If the pilot comes back and says it's not working particularly well, you may be able to revise it and improve it, or you may just have to drop it. One of the big things about decision making is sometimes when you pick a decision and you go with it, if it's not going to work, you have to be willing to let it go. There's something called the sunk cost bias, where people made a decision and they're running with it and it's not working and they just keep throwing more money at it. At some point, as the expression goes, you just have to cut bait. You have to give up and realize that whatever money you lost setting it up may actually be dwarfed by the amount of money of implementing a bad decision or a decision that's not going to be profitable for you. Skunkworks is kind of an R&D process where people come up with kind of a laboratory to come up with new ideas. They're separated from normal operations. People go in there and they're not really following the same rules as everybody else. The idea is that you kind of throw mud on the wall and see what sticks. They come up with a lot of ideas. And sometimes these outlandish ideas that nobody else had thought of actually prove to be quite beneficial. How much time and money you can be able to spend on something like this, it kind of depends on the nature of the organization that you have. If you are an IT company, if you're making apps, if you're trying to come up with the next big thing, this is something that's probably going to be in your DNA and you're going to be doing it quite frequently. If it's a more stable environment where you're making products that have been in the marketplace for years and changes and improvements are relatively slow, you may not want to invest the time and money into this because it may not provide the benefit that it could to another company. It really is up to the top management to figure out what the strategy is going to be about how these types of processes are implemented. Now, this is not in the text, but I did want to end on a couple of things that I used when I taught a decision-making critical thinking course previously. And the idea is that you can make a good decision, meaning that you spent the time looking at the material that you had available, and a reasonable person looking at the decision you made would agree that you made the right decision. It was a good decision. It was unbiased. It was based on all the information you had available to you But sometimes, even then, it just doesn't work. A good decision is you have a thorough rational process. It doesn't necessarily have to be the classical process, but it has to be at least based on something in reality rather than the gut feeling. Even if you have what is known as a good decision, it could still result in failure. You could have a bad decision where someone is completely biased or they don't pay any attention to it, they just flip a coin, and it ends up being the right thing. However, in the long run, if you have a good decision-making process, you will be right more frequently than not. And the reason is if you have a rational process, you are most likely to get a successful outcome. That is what you would expect. So that's the first one here. You have a rational process. It ends up with a successful outcome. The assessment is you had a good decision with a good result, and that's to be expected. If you had an irrational process, you expected to have an outcome that is not successful. You would have a bad decision with a bad result. That's also to be expected. The wild cards are number 3 and 4 on this slide. You could have a rational process that has a bad result. Now that's not to be expected, and most of the time it probably won't happen. You could have a bad process that results in a good result. That's also unlikely to happen very frequently. The idea here is you want to make good decisions and just acknowledge that sometimes they may still result in a bad outcome. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow the process, because the more you follow the process, the more likely you are to be correct, and the least likely you would be to be continually making mistakes. As I mentioned in earlier chapters in the critical thinking materials, the difference between a good manager and an okay manager is just maybe 5%. If you make 5% better decisions than another person over 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, you're going to look like a superstar. If you have a good process, you are more likely, most of the time, to have a good result. Simply because you made a good decision with a bad result doesn't mean you should throw out the process. You should stick with it and evaluate it, because even if you had a good decision, there could be some things that sabotage the outcomes. Some of the things that could happen is unexpected external forces. The market could change, you lost funding, you were making a decision on the basis of some reasonable assumptions, but assumptions that proved not to come to fruition. You didn't get stakeholder buy-in. You need to change a business process, and your employees aren't happy with it. You didn't give them enough prep time, you didn't train them appropriately, and they viewed it negatively. So even if it was a good decision and it should have worked, they may not have wanted to go along with it because they didn't understand it. And that's the mistake in implementation, not in the decision. It could be sabotage. Some people actually don't want you to be successful, and they may take steps to make sure that it doesn't work. There could be some backlash if people don't like the idea. That can be tied to the lack of stakeholder buy-in and sabotage. Backlash is kind of all on the same flavor. Poor implementation, you didn't do a good job training people up, as I mentioned. There could be a lack of follow-through. You announce that there's a new process, and then people give a little bit of backlash, and then you don't follow through on it and make them do it. So then it's just another failed decision that didn't get implemented correctly. There could be changed circumstances. Maybe we came up with a great idea for a product, and now that product is obsolete. Poor assessment of risk. We didn't do a good job figuring out what type of risk there could be. We had bad timing. Having a lemonade stand is a great idea in the middle of summer, but if it takes you until December or January to put it out on the sidewalk, you're probably not going to have a lot of sales. Having that lemonade stand is a good idea, but the timing, it has to be in the right context. You could have unreasonably high expectations. Maybe you started pitching your idea and promising a little bit more than you could actually going to get. A lot of people kind of talk down their expectations to try to manage them so that there's not going to be any kind of backlash coming, because it's not a panacea, whatever you came up with, for all of the things that's ailing the company. And the other thing we've already talked about was groupthink. You didn't have a devil's advocate. You maybe just went off on the wrong decision. That could be a bad decision because you didn't follow a good process into place. But a lot of what I just listed could be things that bring down good decisions and cause bad outcomes. That's the end of chapter 5.